Hi, everyone. This is Mark. Welcome to another lecture in the politics of development. And in this one, we're merging two of my major interests, I think two major interests for a lot of you who enrolled in this course, the environment and sustainable development in particular, and these broader themes in international development efforts around the world. I maintain research and scholarly inquiry in both of these fields. And way back when I myself was an undergrad, my undergraduate degree was actually a combined one in political science and in environmental studies. We have three readings for consideration with this lecture. One, we're reading again from Michael Latham's book, In the Right Kind of Revolution. It's a pretty radical, critical theory-based inquiry into international development. Michael Latham was formerly an academic, and more recently he became the president of a private school for K-12 in the state of Hawaii. And one of the really critical points that Latham makes in this chapter, where he considers sustainable development and neoliberalism, and is that this occurs in the context of a crisis of post-war liberalism, the Keynesian welfare state approach to managing the economy and promoting development, and how it comes under crisis where the left begins to look for more alternative approaches to development, and the right drifts away from this Keynesian consensus as well to advocate for more free market-based approaches. We have a chapter from a very recent book by a full professor from McGill, Vincent Pouliot, and it's a book on global policy making. And so the Sustainable Development Goals represents one of the chapters from this book published by Cambridge University Press in 2023. And we also have an article from 2023 by Scott Moore, a professor from the University of Pennsylvania, who has also been involved in a number of different think tanks and government institutions. And he makes the argument that the raison d'etre of the World Bank ought to be sustainable development. I want you to think a little bit about the emergence of what's sometimes referred to as second wave environmentalism. First wave environmentalism harkens back to the late 19th century, early 20th century, where there was an effort to establish national parks in the United States and elsewhere. Teddy Roosevelt was one of the, as president, was this fundamental figure in establishing and promoting the national parks of the United States. And it was a spirit of conservationism, but also one that was often intimately connected to hunting. For instance, Teddy Roosevelt was, a fairly notorious big game hunter in Africa and in North America. Second wave environmentalism is a little bit different from first wave environmentalism because it's a little bit more radical, that features an urgency that becomes particularly strong in the late 1960s and into the early 1970s. The image here that you have on your screen on the left is sometimes called Earthrise, right? Like sunrise or sunset. Earthrise from the Apollo 8 mission, which is an image of planet Earth from the moon. And what it really captured, the sentiment that was experienced by society, was that of the Earth, of this delicate, fragile, vulnerable blue orb hanging in the nothingness of space with no inputs other than that of the sun. And it led to this notion of a spaceship Earth, how on our planet Earth, we're like a spaceship zooming through space. From the moon, we don't see territorial borders. All we see is a common humanity and one shared planet. And so this image really helped to ignite a sentiment of conservation in the US and Europe and Canada and many places around the world. Another example of this movement of environmentalism of the 1960s is the figure that you see on the right of your screen, Rachel Carson. And Rachel Carson was a biologist and a writer, a woman in a time when the natural sciences were like overwhelmingly male. And Carson becomes this prolific public intellectual on preserving the natural world. In what's probably her most famous book called Silent Spring, she helps bring the reader into thinking about the context of the New England states of the northeastern US and Maine, and how notably silent it is walking through the woods in summertime or in springtime. And she says, well, why is that? And she suggests that it's because we don't hear the baby chicks chattering away. And she is investigating why that might be the case. And she comes to the conclusion that she believes it's because the pesticide DDT is resulting in eggshell thickness to be reduced so much that mother birds are crushing their unhatched chicks in their eggs while they're trying to keep the eggs warm. And she presents this really powerful, memorable critique on what the context is for this. She says that this isn't the intended effect. Farmers aren't spraying DDT to kill these unhatched chicks, but rather they're doing it because of this agricultural revolution, this green revolution that has really picked up momentum over the last couple of decades. And they're doing it to boost crop productivity. And what Carson's message is that the pursuit of productivity, of efficiency, of development may not be inherently sustainable. And so our push towards greater efficiency may have some adverse effects, some unintended consequences that will harm the ability of sustainability. And this period of time is part of a broader counterculture movement as well, where the prevailing norms and institutions in much of the liberal democratic world is being challenged because of the problems so blatantly arrayed around it, such as the civil rights movement. Another example that Latham talks about in his chapter is the feminine mystique as well by Friedan. And in this work of second wave feminism, what she does is that she is thinking about challenging this norm about how it is a distinctly mysterious feature of women that they can find fulfillment in managing the household, taking care of the kids, taking care of their husband, and really sacrificing their own ambitions outside of the house. And what Friedan says, based on her research with these primarily middle-class white women, is that, well, actually, they're not fulfilled. She even really, really memorably talks about the house as a kind of concentration camp and says that it is not a feminine mystique to be fulfilled, but rather they're repressing and bottling up their frustrations over what it is they're sacrificing to take care of others, and that it is unjust. And so it's part of the civil rights movement during this time is another big example. And so it's this broader counter-cultural movement that environmentalism is a product of. And a lot of that push towards recognizing a spirit of environmentalism comes from this tension observed between development and sustainability. It's at this time where you see a dramatic growth in the number of international treaties and conventions on the environment. The biggest one, the one that really flows from the second wave of environmentalism, is the 1972 Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment, which at the time has this really strong presence of Canadian diplomats, Maurice Strong, is the Secretary General of the conference, a Canadian diplomat. It involves representatives from most of the world, 119 countries, is an extremely high number for the early 1970s, as decolonization has been occurring, and it involves a declaration of a number of principles, almost 30 principles. Some of the norms established from here is that the governments of the world, both the global north and the global south, would establish ministries of the environment, something distinct from natural resources. And so there is this general position in the United Nations that we should not simply have an anthropocentric view of the natural world. That means a human-centered view. Natural resource ministries such as fisheries and forestry, they're often looking at the extractive side of the natural world, what it is that countries can be using to advance their own development, to generate their own economic activity, to generate revenue for the government. And at Stockholm, they want to have a cautionary note on that approach. And they point out that it has to be balanced with a different kind of governmental insight on the environment that sees an intrinsic value to it. That's not just a value that is based on what it can do for the economy. So once again, it's intimately connected to these questions of development. The United Nations Environmental Program is founded here, and these various global and regional monitoring networks to try to have a better understanding of regional and global effects on the environment. And so a lot of what they're thinking about here is ocean pollution, which is really significant at this time. Questions over what to do with nuclear waste for some of these nuclear powers. There's these other broader questions too about the loss, rainforest loss. Acid rain is another major issue at Stockholm, and transboundary smog as well. And this is really the early days of some notes being made on the possibility of an anthropogenic greenhouse effect. It was really just a few years before the Stockholm conference when NASA really has some internal consensus on the theory behind carbon in the atmosphere leading to a greenhouse effect. And it's based on these observations that NASA was making in the 1960s on how Mercury is closer to the sun than any other planet, but Venus is way hotter than Mercury. And it's because of those gases, as they conclude. And what's really incredible about Stockholm is it's a radical discussion on the environment. And it was described by one prominent scholar who observed the proceedings as launching a new liberation movement to free men from the threat of their thraldom to environmental perils of their own making. And it denounced global poverty, it denounced global racism, as well as war. And so they're even here at the beginning of this second wave environmentalism at the Stockholm Conference in 1972. You have the Global South featured very, very prominently here. And it's so radical, they are even debating whether or not we should be aiming for no growth. So an economic stasis, as it were, because of these fears of whether or not we can overextend our growth and lead to a broader collapse. This is the time, as Latham noted, of the limits to growth document that was drafted by an international team that really sounded the warning bells of a potential Malthusian trap, named after the 19th century economist Thomas Malthus, who was really worried about population growth leading to not to economic growth, but rather to a civilizational collapse of sorts. It was a time as well characterized by the work of Garrett Hardin in his Tragedy of the Commons, noting that it is the commons, the air, the land that's not owned by people, and the water that is most at risk of environmental degradation. And in general, in 72, there is this linking of the environment to the economy in a vague, ill-defined way. What they set up for future conferences at Stockholm is that there needs to be new conceptions of sovereignty for the common good. So this general idea that having the states as the supreme sovereign authority of the international system is potentially deeply problematic for sustainability, that our general development may need to have the brakes put on it, and states perhaps need to be accountable to some kind of higher order to get them to comply to these more sustainably minded goals. It called for stronger international law, noting that the soft law and customary law of the international system may not be well suited to really make a difference to prevent these environmental degradation and possible social collapse, better management, and even, it says, creating financial and economic instruments to reduce consumption itself. So extremely radical perspectives that are expressed in this 1972 Stockholm Convention. And as Latham discusses, it's in 1987 where the UN creates what's called the Brundtland Commission to try to put together a reflection on what it is they mean by sustainable development. So 15 years after Stockholm, how should we think about sustainable development? The former Prime Minister of Norway, Gro Harlem Brundtland, put together an international team, including Canadian diplomats, to try to define what it is they mean by sustainable development. And they memorably phrase it as to meet the needs of today without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. It's a book that you can find at the UBC library. And it's not just your typical UN style resolution or document, but instead it's a book. It's academic, it's kind of philosophical. And it's not so much organizational or policy based, but it represents these general musings and ideas of what it is sustainable development should be for the UN structure. And they link economy with society, and by society, they sometimes change it to equity to make it 3 E's. So there's that symmetry. So the economy, society, and the environment, recognizing that they're all interdependently linked to each other, that degrading one area will have a broader impact across all 3 pillars. So to degrade the environment is to potentially degrade a country's ability to economically provide for itself, or deepening inequity or inequality in a society will harm its economy and may in fact harm the environment, and economic harm may actually harm the environment as well. So the 3 are very much linked, and it forms a triangle by their decision to have these 3 pillars that are linked with each other. And this is by no means coincidental either, that there is an allegory to it because of what a triangle represents. For the philosopher Hegel, who was a predecessor to Marx in some ways, and for Marx himself, that the triangle, it represents contestation and change. So for Hegel, it was thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So by having competing forces with each other, then change can happen. It's why for those of you who are BSc students, or maybe you've taken a lot of chemistry courses in high school or at university, you'll know that in a chemical equation, the symbol for change is delta, and delta is a triangle. And this is what the Brundtland Commission is invoking in our common future, a triangle for change. They have these ideas too about linking the local to the global. This is where that whole expression comes from, recognizing that environmental problems and sustainability, it flows all across here. And they note that there's different strategies. There can be reactive ones, which are sometimes called end of pipe. So trying to just slightly modify an industrial activity of some sort or an economic activity to limit the environmental degradation. Another one is substituting, so trying to swap a different fuel in, for instance, or different energy source. Energy use is still the largest contributor to climate change, or at least it's basically even between energy use and land use potentially. And so in an anticipatory strategy for trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is, for instance, that one federal government or tax rebate on trying to get people to switch their gas furnaces, for instance, to these heat pumps, because for most of Canada, though not as true for the prairies, the electrical grid is generated by a lot of renewable energy, such as water power, for instance, and so they can dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But they also call for some radical strategies as well, recognizing that to really make big gains towards sustainable development, they're going to have to, society and the economy and the world is going to have to maybe even get a little bit radical, changing the very basis of industrial relations in some way. An example being a change from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles. Another point that they make here in this philosophical and academic UN book on sustainable development are the different social dimensions. And what they note is that sustainability needs to come from governmental and international organizational strategy. That is the top of the pyramid, and that will ultimately be, it's about making decisions by government, by the World Bank, by the International Monetary Fund, to try to contribute towards a greater sense of what is sustainable and how development can be achieved in places like the Global South without actually increasing environmental degradation, a monumental task that is laid out before the world. And constituting the second level of the triangle or the pyramid here is that of ideology, and noting that government is only going to pursue strategies of sustainable development if parties and leaders and public officials begin to accept sustainability on some ideological levels, recognizing that the pursuit of economic growth needs to be made in tandem with both questions of equity for society as well as for environmental stewardship. And then finally, at the bottom of the triangle, or pyramid, I said pyramid first for some reason, like I'm thinking three-dimensionally, are broader values. And it notes that ultimately, this is only really going to occur, ideological support for sustainability, government strategies, that will only really be realized if there are these broader social values that accept sustainability all around the world. And so it's the bottom of the triangle, but based on the surface area or the volume, if you're thinking like a pyramid, like I am right now for some unknown reason, it's the largest, right? It's the largest part of the triangle. The greatest surface area or the greatest volume is at the bottom of it, and it represents the biggest weight that the rest of the triangle is based on. There's a number of criticisms that emerged of our common future. It was denounced as being too Western-centric. Most of the contributors to it were from these Western liberal democracies. It doesn't really provide any discussion for economic reorganization or even how it thinks that global equity is going to be achieved. So how is the Global South really going to be encouraged to catch up to the West? This is a time really before the so-called Great Convergence is potentially happening. This is the middle of the debt crisis for the Global South. And though it notes global equity between the North and the South in these broad ways, it doesn't really lay out a position on how this can be achieved. Are there common interests between corporations and states? Is there common interest our shared purpose between developed and developing countries? Is it naive on these hopes that the world will come together? In hindsight, as things transpire, there is a moment where it looks as if North-South cooperation may in fact be realized on environmental issues. And the greatest example of this is occurring at the same time that Our Common Future is released in 1987 here in Canada, in Montreal, with the protocol on ending the use of ozone-depleting substances. In the 1970s, it was observed that there is a thinning of the ozone layer, including the actual holes in the ozone layer over Antarctica in particular. And they realized that it was caused by chlorofluorocarbons, these benzene rings, where the chlorine can react with the O3 in the stratosphere. O3 is a pretty unstable molecule, right? It wants to be O2, has oxygen, and the chlorine from the benzene rings of the chlorofluorocarbons basically stripping off an O negative from the O3 molecule, turning it into O2 and then an O negative. So creating a thinning of the ozone layer, representing a really serious threat to human life on the planet and life in general. There was a previous mass extinction played out hundreds of millions of years ago, where at least part of it, what was going on was really high levels of ozone in the world. And what happened is that even though at first there was some pushback about substituting CFCs out of industrial activity, one of the most prominent areas where, here's a use of CFCs. It was in aerosols. So aerosol cans, like, hairspray and stuff had it. And there was pushback against it at first. One of the leading chemical companies, DuPont, wasn't really committed to making a change, but it resulted in industry cooperation to substitute CFCs eventually for HCFCs, which wouldn't deplete the ozone layer nearly as much, and then even pushing to replace the hydrochlorofluorocarbons with another substitution that really allows the ozone layer to recover. And here is a quote that says, "The Montreal Protocol is a model of cooperation, a product of the recognition of international consensus that ozone depletion is a global problem, both in terms of its causes and its effects. The protocol is the result of an extraordinary process of scientific study, negotiations among representatives of the business and environmental communities, and international diplomacy. It is a monumental achievement." The North was promising the global South that they would help wean them off the use of these chlorofluorocarbons. And that quote comes from Ronald Reagan in 1988, a president who was by no means an ardent supporter of environmentalism. He once famously said in a speech how trees pollute more than they clean up the natural world. So, no real hero of environmentalism, but it was a protocol that was so well crafted that even Ronald Reagan would sign it and support it, and to extol its great contributions to the world. It's just 5 years after the great success of the Montreal Protocol where the world came together in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro for the Earth Summit. And this is the big successor to the Stockholm Convention, which occurred 20 years before this. 108 heads of state, 172 governments represented, and NGOs too, for the first time, are present in a really major way. And this would set a new precedent where NGOs would be invited as delegations to environmental conferences. And the Conference of Parties are certainly, at least the latter half of them, have been defined by the badges provided to NGOs and to institutions of higher learning to allow the community more broadly to be a part of it. And the Earth Summit, it talks about new and equitable global partnerships among key states, about working between the global North and the global South, the integrity of the global environment, and the interdependent nature of Earth. And the Earth Summit, though, it doesn't go as radical as the Stockholm Convention went, that it feels more like the UN Charter itself in affirming the sovereignty of states, and also really tries to reaffirm the anthropocentrism, the central point of people in nature. And it also really pushes back on these notions of linking the environment to the economy and equity in the powerful ways imagined by the Brundtland Commission, and really notes that sovereign states are going to make these decisions on environmental use. Now, I would even go so far as to say in Annex 1 of the Earth Summit, the vast majority of the principles are affirmations of state sovereignty. It did produce a convention on biological diversity. Biodiversity was even nicknamed Rio Diversity briefly for a while, and it resulted in states in general in the North and the South agreeing that they need to preserve at least 12% of natural spaces. Ultimately, that 12% was not decided based on scientific reasoning or basis, but rather it was the product of international diplomacy, that this was the best that they could get states to recognize at this convention. Instead, it actually went in defiance to the ecological perspective of people like Edward Wilson, who was an ecologist, an entomologist who just died just recently, just a few years ago, who described the species area relationship, where he noted that even when you create parks, if you are limiting the green space, you are inevitably going to lead to biodiversity loss. And a lot of the research originally came from how islands just off of continents have dramatically less biodiversity than the continent itself, such as some of these islands off the coast of South America. It included Agenda 21, discussed in the Latham chapter, as well as founding the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And it's climate change that would really be the central focus for sustainable development efforts in the 90s up to today. And it's because of the challenges involved. There was this idea from development studies and the environment called the Kuznets curve. And what it noted is that as countries would go through these stages of economic development, they're going to increase their environmental degradation as they move from a pre-industrial economy to an industrial economy, but then they're going to decline. Then their environmental degradation will decline as their per capita income growth is stronger. So as they move into a realm of a middle income country, upper middle income country, eventually into a higher income level, that they are going to then see their effects on the environment decline, and they will be wealthier and better off. And the climate change complicates the Kuznets curve quite dramatically, because what you have is a massive, massive expansion in the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that occur as countries industrialize. For instance, China now emits about twice as much greenhouse gas as the United States, for instance. But what is intractable to the issues on climate change is who really is responsible for committing to the reductions. And this has been the crunch point, the hammer upon which the Conference of Parties have been forged, because the West has been pushing back because they don't want to commit to major reductions that occur outside of the business as usual models if the Global South isn't making some kind of commitments as well. The Conference of Parties also includes the creation of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, scientists and climatologists from around the world, over 2,000 of them dedicated to the study of the anthropogenic greenhouse effect. The Kyoto Protocol, the third Conference of Parties, the most famous, or at least with the Paris Accord, the second most famous, where it really wanted it noted that there's the largest share of historical and current global emissions of greenhouse gases, of course, back in 1997, has originated in developed countries, and that the per capita emissions in developing countries are still relatively low. And so it did put the onus and responsibility on countries like the United States and Canada, Western Europe, to make these reductions without requiring commitments from other countries. And it notes certain scientific uncertainties, which would really divide and polarize society for a time, as well as noting that this does not change the basic underlying principles of sovereignty in the rules-based international order, which is something, remember, the Stockholm Convention, as well as our common future, was hedging on, right? They thought that in order for there to be real changes, sovereign states likely need to be accountable to some kind of higher power. The US Congress, so the United States administration of Bill Clinton and Al Gore, they sign the Kyoto Protocol. Al Gore was already a well-established figure in the environmental movement from a book that he wrote called Earth in the Balance, which, you know, it feels, it's a radical title because it's a pretty radical book, because it really has this limits to growth general understanding of how we may pass certain tipping points and create irreversible degradation to our natural world. But Al Gore was not seen as someone who necessarily delivered too strongly during this very pro-business climate of the Clinton administration, and for their legacy and for Al Gore's own future ambitions to seek the nomination of the Democratic Party. He wanted to deliver something big and tangible. He signed the Kyoto Protocol, even though the US was a part of an alliance, along with the United States, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, that was, and included other OPEC members like Saudi, that wanted to push back and not commit to too much. But it all became moot because the US Congress voted to not ratify it. The ratification of international treaties and the Constitution does fall within the powers of the US Senate. Not a single US senator voted in favor of ratification at the time. And then the George W. Bush administration simply reneged on the original signing. Sustainable development became an issue in 2005 in Johannesburg, South Africa. It included a point on indigenous forms of knowledge needed to inform and to provide perspective on sustainable development, which represents something of a change from our common future, where it was seen as too Western-centric. In Johannesburg in South Africa, you know, this position was really taken up, and indigenous peoples in particular were noted as being significant, though it also was described as something of a post-mortem on sustainable development. So from our common future, and in the years that followed, sustainable development got mainstreamed in the United Nations, in the World Bank, and other big international financial institutions. It got mainstreamed in government documents around the world, but it wasn't necessarily seen as delivering much in the way of tangibles. Like, in what ways was it directly helping to conserve and protect the natural world? And so here in Johannesburg, it was even questioned whether or not sustainable development had died. The United States had reservations about attending the Rio conference in 1992. It was Elizabeth May at the time who said that Brian Mulroney, the Prime Minister of Canada from the Progressive Conservative Party, saved the Rio conference because Mulroney had a friendship with both Ronald Reagan as well as President George H.W. Bush. And Mulroney supposedly convinced President Bush to go and attend the Rio conference. But here in 2005, the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, the original son, didn't want to attend. There was a lot of finger pointing, and here you really began to see the lack of shared purpose between the global North and the global South. And this is the point made in a book that came out a few years ago, one published by Cambridge. It's a really interesting one, Why We Disagree About Climate Change. And he noted a number of different points of contention, such as how public perceptions of the science behind it was distorted because the skeptics were seen as having as strong an argument as those who believed that there was an anthropogenic greenhouse effect, even though it was really a minority of the scientific community who has said that the press would want to, especially mainstream media, this is before our polarized era, by the way, but what a lot of the mainstream media would try to do is to say that there was a contention or a lack of consensus on an issue and talk about the divide. Like this group feels this way, this other group feels this other way. And what Mike Holm noted is that newspapers were doing this on climate change and not really informing the public that it is really a small minority of those climate scientists that were raising these concerns about the science of an anthropogenic greenhouse effect, that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change had concluded as way back in the mid-1990s in their second assessment report that they thought that it was a scientific certainty grounded in natural science. Domestic politics played a role in this as well. There was time inconsistencies. And so there was this overriding fear, especially in Western liberal democracies, that we are going to have to impose a kind of economic recession or limit our economic growth in some way to try to meet our commitments under Kyoto and other protocols. And this came out in part because some of the countries that were very successful at reducing their greenhouse gas emissions, such as Germany and in Eastern Europe, like this kind of happened about organically as the Soviet Union collapsed and their heavy industry started to essentially fall apart. But ultimately, it comes down to the state of international politics and the fragmentation, right? The divide between the North and the South, as we see in this little map here. In Bali in 2007 in Indonesia, there was an attempt to try to get consensus on a post-Kyoto commitment, and it fell flat. And Denmark in 2009, at the end of 2009 at COP15, you had a massive conference supported by President Obama in his first year in office, where he probably has his highest levels of idealism. They wanted to have a really definite timetable and commitment for reductions. And what happened at the last hour, basically, is that the 200-page document that was drafted got rejected because the Global South would not accept it. Right? Primarily China and India, but a number of countries in the Global South pushed back, said there's absolutely no way we could make these commitments to it because of these ongoing issues of maldevelopment in the Global South, that there is this thinking that, you know, you in the West, right, the wealthiest countries in the world are worried about how this might affect your economic development. Their position is, you know, we are still struggling with absolute poverty, with real developmental challenges, and you expect us to make commitments to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And it got scrapped. It was thrown in the wastebasket. And what emerged instead was a 2.5-page statement on how, well, countries need to figure this out, basically, where they made these informal agreements. It's Paris, though, you know, Copenhagen is at the beginning of the Obama administration. Paris is really towards the end, and it's at Paris where the United States is able to find some degree of shared purpose with developing countries, particularly China, on making some real commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, as China began to really, though it's still the heaviest polluter in an absolute sense in the world, it's began to initiate major changes, especially in areas of battery construction. And Scott Moore, one of the authors that we read today, his latest book is actually looking at the green energy policies emerging from the Chinese Communist Party, and noting that China's become the center of electric vehicle battery production, but while simultaneously having policies that are still unbelievably unsustainable in terms of the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that they're releasing is unprecedented compared to any other country. But the other issue too is whether or not the electric vehicle battery production is sustainable at all, or just extremely destructive. And so to think a little bit about the Puleo article, chapter from his book on global public policy making, that at the same time as the Paris Accord is being negotiated, the United Nations is simultaneously transforming the Millennium Development Goals into the Sustainable Development Goals, enhancing them, drafting a number of others, and setting almost 170 social, economic, and environmental development targets for the world. As it notes transitioning development away from a post-colonial to a global project. And so returning to some of these themes from Stockholm in 1972 or Our Common Future from 1987 of trying to have a whole new type of paradigm on balancing economic growth with environmental stewardship. And Puleo makes a number of really fascinating observations. One is that it is an open-ended improvisation that is occurring, where during the summit throughout 2014 and 2015, leading to the General Assembly adopting the Sustainable Development Goals, they didn't really know how it was all going to play out. So, like for instance, the UNDG that's really was built to negotiate these Sustainable Development Goals, they consulted with stakeholders from 100 countries. And it's why the Sustainable Development Goals represents probably the most, though it was problematic, it was still probably the most inclusive document and statement that the UN ever created. It included a huge survey called My World, asking people their thoughts on sustainability and economic development. But they noted that, well, this one may not really be all that inclusive because 80% of the respondents, 4/5 of them, came from just these 5 countries. There was also this chair position held by the members of the Global South as well as the Global North. So UK Prime Minister David Cameron worked with the former president of Indonesia, SBY, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono. He's no longer president of Indonesia. This is David Cameron's no longer prime minister of the UK, but they held this one major group that was trying to really bridge a global north, global south divide, and how it was imagining targets would be set for sustainable development. There's a whole network to try to encourage greater discussions on sustainability. And still, though, it was described as, this was in quotation marks in the Puleo chapter, it was antagonistic, right? That this did not come easy. It was no predetermined outcome. And there was a great deal of antagonism that followed from these dynamics. A second point that he makes, it was about those debates on sustainable development really exposing the depth of the North-South divide, or as the Indian delegation memorably put it, the North-South fact, right? They said, don't call it a divide, call it a fact. And what was driving this fact or divide was the basic questions, right? What is the problem? Whereas countries in the global north were focusing on individual exclusion from the market, whereas countries in the global south wanted the focus to be more on the systemic features of the global political economy. What are the ends was another question posed. And so countries in the global north, though not all of them necessarily, but certain troikas really wanted to say that it was political, that in order to achieve sustainable development, there needed to be a predictable and reliable rule of law, of civil liberties and political rights being protected for people around the world, and that this was intimately connected to sustainable development, right? There was a focus on human rights, whereas certain countries in the global south, including what was the China, Indonesia, Kazakhstan troika, was really pushing back against that and saying human rights should not be a part of a framework of thinking about the end point of sustainable development, right? It can't have a focus on human rights. It's really not surprising that Kazakhstan would have a position like that, or that the Chinese Communist Party would have a position like that. But it is fairly surprising that Indonesia, of all countries, would in fact take this position. There was a time just a few years before this when Indonesia was the main voice arguing for human rights, rule of law, and the spread of democratic norms in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and in the Islamic world more generally. But by this time, I think this is really the debates here for the Sustainable Development Goals. It was indicative of what was about to be the democratic recession. I think it was just building up momentum at this point. The West wanted to have more of a focus on capacity for humans to innovate, and this was something that the Global South could accept largely as well. But it was the NGOs present that really wanted to return to some points on there being limits to growth, that maybe the world doesn't have that capacity. Innovations, from the NGO perspective, can just lead to a whole different set of sustainability issues, such as moving from fossil fuels to electric vehicle batteries. Well, what about all of these mines? How we open toxic mines for the extraction of rare earth minerals? Or what about the state of actual slavery in the Democratic Republic of the Congo's eastern provinces, where the cobalt is being extracted for the lithium batteries, right? And so NGOs are really having a stronger voice here, and it shows that you have these north-south divides, but you also have these NGO and state divides as well. And finally, the question is, well, by what means will sustainable development be achieved? There's this idea of common but differentiated responsibilities between what it is the global north can provide versus the global south. And there was also a divide between the north and the south on whether or not it is governments who are responsible for implementing these goals, or it's the responsibility of these international organizations that may have a broader disruptive effect on the systemic causes of underdevelopment. And so the North is saying, governments are ultimately responsible, but the position of the Global South is one that, at least on some levels, is saying that you need to have a broader reform of the rules-based international economy that will lead to conditions more conducive to a broader development. So you have a debate there, and a debate on whether or not technical experts should have more of a voice in prescribing solutions. And for countries in the global south, especially those who went through the period of the 80s and 90s where the IMF was trying to dictate policy to them, they pushed back on that. They thought, what, we can't just leave it to the experts. Instead, sovereign governments need to make their decisions on how it is they're going to implement these ideas and achieve sustainable development. And so the divides are really quite fierce. The troika that Canada was a part of for the Sustainable Development Goals was actually with the United States and Israel. It's noted a few times in that chapter. And the NGOs in particular, one of the criticisms they had of this idea of innovating as a way of coming to a solution, they denounced that as a Prometheus discourse. Prometheus being the guy from the Greek world who, steals fire from the gods. And for them, they think that, this is a delusion that people have, that they have the capacity to fix things through their own ingenuity. COP21 was the Paris Accord. More recently, though, COP27, known as Africa's COP, held in Egypt at the resort city of Sharm el-Sheikh. And it was also described, though, by a lot of the media as the great cop out. If you look at the top 10 countries for size of delegation sent to COP, there was only one country that was from the OECD, representing the advanced liberal democracies of the world, of North America, Europe, and East Asia. There was one country. Anyone know it was off the top of their head? It's Canada. Canada was the only country in the for top 10 for size of delegations from the OECD, the richest countries in the world. Instead, the largest delegation came from the United Arab Emirates, I believe. Brazil was one of the largest. A number of African countries were also in that top 10. And the US sent a very small delegation of only like 130 something people. And at the time, it was really, there was some pushback against it from the global north, where they didn't really want to commit to this. They thought that it was simply going to be a blaming and shaming of the global north. And so they were reluctant to participate. And incredibly, even China didn't really send much of a delegation, that they only sent around 65 delegates to Sharm el-Sheikh. And it was a pretty radical conference of parties. So I think the most radical of them all, to be honest. There were initiatives noted on increasing developmental capital for the global south. And they called, for instance, this is called the cover decision, to achieve major sustainability gains in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and for building climate resiliency, where so many of the countries of the global south are really on the front lines of climate change due to drought conditions, due to changes in sea level. They called for about $4 to $6 trillion US per year for climate mitigation and for resilience adaptation. And this is an astronomical figure, right? This is so huge. The norm, for instance, for the climate fund that was talked about for the Paris Accord was around 100 billion US, like a fraction. And as Scott Moore notes, the World Bank is spending each year recently just over $30 billion a year on climate mitigation and adaptation resilience, right? But they know it's going to be around $4 to $6 trillion per year, just an astronomical figure. Finally, we'll conclude with some thoughts on the World Bank from the Scott Moore article. The Treasury Secretary of the Biden administration, Janet Yellen, called for the evolution of the World Bank to make itself more relevant, and a comment echoed by a number of individuals from the global south, including the Maldives environment minister, on a fundamental shift. And Moore's position is that should be the niche. Climate change should be the niche for the World Bank. That should be the reason for the World Bank's existence at this point. It doesn't necessarily have a really good record for encouraging international development, and the successes are all kind of controversial. Think back to the Dambisa Moyo book. Now, she doesn't necessarily blame the World Bank too specifically and too sternly for maldevelopment in Africa, but she finds it hard to really identify some effective work of the World Bank. Instead, Moore says they should do fewer things better. For instance, it should focus on measuring where the World Bank can have an impact on mitigation and resilience, to be more directly focused on policy towards this. Climate resilience is really the biggest strategy for the major cities of the world. So they're trying to think about how it is they can preserve and enhance quality of life for citizens in the context of a warming up planet, and to maximize funding into climate investment. And the World Bank, though, has been pretty bearish on investing into climate initiatives, right? They're not very optimistic about it because they've been worried for quite a number of years that by sinking money into climate mitigation and climate resilience, that it is going to really have a weak return on investment that may even harm the World Bank's AAA credit rating, right? It may not really survive that big push because of the concern. This is something that's even in Barack Obama's memoirs, the really, really thick memoirs that came out just a little while ago. And it was on how the administration was really trying to kickstart a renewable energy revolution. And what happened was no obvious major benefits from it. For instance, there was one company that even took $130 million in capital from the federal government and went bankrupt within a couple of years, right? They went out of business. And the World Bank also is kind of mindful of some of the riskiness and the liabilities on climate investment, has been really hesitant. But Scott Moore says that the threat of climate change is so fierce, about 130 million people can be pushed into poverty within a decade around the world. It's a threat to all the other World Bank's development goals. And maybe what the World Bank can do is to work against the tides pushing and pulling the North and the South apart. That maybe the World Bank has been more effective than critics would say on bridging between geopolitical rivals, right? China joined the World Bank back in 1980. The Soviet Union even did in 86 when the Cold War, just before it ended, was like burning hot. And so there is potentially a place for the World Bank to try to find that shared purpose between the North and the South on climate mitigation and adaptation, and balancing that with the general goals of sustainable development. Okay, that's it for this one. Up next is going to be test number 3 if you're watching this, and then following that, lecture on China's Belt and Road Initiative. Okay, have a good one. Take care, folks.